In some recent shiurim, I addressed the topic of Giyus, military service, Limud Torah, Talmud Torah, and certain claims made by certain Rabbanim with regards to these questions. We won't go over everything again. It was all recorded. You can view it at your leisure. In those shiurim, I related to specific points made by certain people, certain camps, certain schools of thought. One such idea was, for example, I quoted a certain Rav who made the claim that in the wars of David HaMelech, no one was killed and no one was injured. A very interesting claim, as I pointed out, seeing that we see in the Tanakh and in Chazal explicitly that it is not so. Not our sort. It would be nice if it could be so, but it's not so. When in the one case when it was so, in the case of Milchemet Midyan, the officers of the army came to Moshe Rabbeinu in a state of shock, and they said to him, "We've counted our troops, and lo nifkad meitanu echad, not one of us was killed." That's incredible. That's not normal. Mashma, every other case, it's not so. Unless you're told that it is so, it's not so. Uriah Hitti died because people were dying in battle, and he was sent to be in a particular place where he had a greater chance of being struck. Unfortunately, it was a terrible thing, a sinful thing to do, as we know. But the fact is, people were dying on the battlefield. And other claims were made. I heard a certain Haredi Rav say recently that no Bahur Yeshiva should even consider the idea of going to the army. Army is not important, literally in those words. Zelo Hashuv. What matters, what counts, is studying Torah. And that's what you need to do. And this is something that we have to understand, that, as I said, I related to certain specific claims and certain ideas that were raised by certain Chachamim and certain ideologies, and I brought sources to disprove those assumptions. But we have to understand that there is something which underpins all of these ideas, all of these statements, all of these claims. And that really is the question of how this world should work. How does the world work according to the Torah? How should we assume and understand and expect the world to work according to the Torah? And we have on this very question, regarding this very question, we have a number of well-known sources. Let us begin on page 2, actually. We'll begin on page 2, and then we'll go back to page 1. On number 2, the Sifrei Parashat Ekev. We have on the famous pasuk that we read every day in Kriyat Shema, V'asafta d'chanecha v'tiroshecha v'yisarecha. Right? The Torah says that if you will walk in the way of the Torah and you will follow my instruction, then you will be able to harvest your crop in peace, and you will be successful. So the Sifrei says as follows: "V'asafta d'chanecha lama ne'emar lefi shene'emar lo yamush sefer haTorah hazeh mipicha," as it says at the beginning of Yoshua, where Hashem, who speaks to Yoshua bin Nun. And keep in mind, Yoshua bin Nun is not a Rosh Yeshiva in the sense that you would imagine today. He was an Ish Torah, but he was also a general. He was also a political leader. And Hashem says, "Lo yamush sefer haTorah hazeh mipicha." That's true. Now, if you take that absolutely literally, Shome'ani kemashma'o, that means that there's no time for anything else. You have to Lo yamush sefer haTorah hazeh mipicha. Mamash, you sit and learn Torah And there's no time for all these other things that you need to do now, which is conquer Eretz Yisrael and divide the land between the Shevatim, etc., etc. Who's going to have time for that? Tilmod lomar v'asafta d'ronecha derech eretz dibera Torah divrei Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Ishmael's position is what I think most people, normal, intelligent people, would assume is the position of the Torah, which is derech eretz and Torah go together. Derech eretz means the way of the world, working, functioning in the world as the world is, not in some hypothetical and non-existent reality. So Rabbi Ishmael says, you are supposed to function in this world and work in the field and make a living and what's called minhag derech eretz, as we shall see. And you should also study Torah. You have to do both. That's what Rabbi Ishmael says. This is the original, the earliest version of this discussion in the Sifrei. We'll see other versions presently. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says something different. He says, "Ena davar sof." But that's not possible. How are you going to be able to study Torah if koser b'sha'at kasir, horesh b'sha'at horish? In other words, you plow and you seed the soil and you work the fields each different times of the year, each in its own season. Dash b'sha'at sharav v'zoreh b'sha'at ruach. When will you have time for Torah? Working the fields is time consuming, it's not easy. That's why, after all, we have the concept of the summer vacation in schools nowadays, because in July and August, when most people were living off the land, when most people were farmers in Europe and the United States, etc., you needed all hands on deck during the summer, those 2 months, for the harvest, because it's very labor intensive and you can't afford to have your children and teenagers in schools and colleges, etc. You need them right now on the field with you. So that's why we have 2 months right there of the year are gone for all scholastic purposes, because of this historical reality, which doesn't apply for most people today. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, if you want to work in that way in this world, you'll never have time to study Torah. Certainly not to study Torah on a high level. That's what he assumes. The truth is that when Am Yisrael completely commits itself to doing the will of Hashem, then their work will be done by others. They won't have to do these things themselves. שנאמר, ועמדו זרים ולזונכם, וכשאינם עושים רצון המקום, מלאכתם נעשית על ידי עצמם. And when they do not commit themselves fully to doing the will of Hashem, then they have to work for a living and live in the real world. And it can also be even worse, that you end up having to work for your enemies. That's one version, the straightforward, simple version of this discussion. The more well-known version appears in the Talmud Bavli. This is on page number 1. Talmud Bavli, Barachot Lamed Hey. And here we read as follows: Tanor Rabbanan, Wa'asafta d'Ranecha, Matil Modlomar. What is it coming to teach you? What does that mean? What is the question? The Torah doesn't tell you you must eat. Everyone knows you have to eat, you have to drink if you wish to live. You have to sleep. The Torah doesn't say V'halachta lishon. There's no such commandment in the Torah. V'yashanta al mitothecha. It doesn't say such a thing. Why? Obvious. So why does it say Wa'asafta d'Ranecha? Why does it have to state the obvious, that you have to work in the field and plow and seed and harvest, etc.? Lefi shene'emar lo yamush sefer haTorah hazeh mipicha Yachol Devarim Kichtavam Tilmod Lomar V'asafta Devanecha. Just in case you may take too literally the pasuk in Yoshua, Lo Yamush Sefer Torah Zemi Picha, that this Torah should not leave your mouth. You may take it too literally. You should know this means V'asafta Devanecha together with Lo Yamush Sefer Torah Zemi Picha. These things go together. Therefore, Hanher Bahem Minhag Derech Eretz. In other words, live in the real world. As Rashi says at the bottom of the page, Dvarim kichtavam shelo yasok b'derech eretz. You may think it means lo yamush means lo yasok bichlal b'derech eretz. Hanher bahem im divrei Torah. You have to live in the world, interact with the world, and you must also be completely committed to the study of Torah as much as you're able. That is the position of Rabbi Ishmael. Rabi Shimon ben Yochai says, no. Efshar adam horesh b'sha'at harisha, v'zorah b'sha'at zari'ah, v'qaseh b'sha'at qasira, v'dash b'sha'at disha. A person, an agriculturalist, has to know when to sow, when to plow, when to do all these various activities at the right time, in the right way. They're all very time consuming. V'zorah b'sha'at haruah, Torah mataheh aleh. When will he have time for the study of Torah? So again, as we saw before, when Am Yisrael is committed to doing the will of Hashem, others will take care of these things for them. In other words, others, foreigners, will do these things for you, and you'll be free to study Torah. And when this is not so, when Am Yisrael is not fully committed to doing the will of Hashem, or Has v'Shalom, mamash doing something quite different, then they have to take care of these things themselves. So Wa'asafta d'chanecha, according to Rabbi Ishmael, is l'chatchila. That's how it should be. That's the normal way of the world. Zo darko shel olam, zo darka shel Torah. According to Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, V'asafta d'chanecha is b'di'avad. It's only if you're not sufficiently in communion with Hashem that you will have to do these things. ולא עוד אלא שמלאכת אחרים נעשית על ידם, שנאמר ועבדת את אויביך אשר ישלחנו אדוני בך ברעב ובצמא ובעירום ובחוסר כל. That is the end of the discussion. So between Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. So a person has to ask themselves, what am I to do? How should I live my life? According to Rabbi Ishmael or according to Rabbi Shimon? Abaye tells you. The Talmud immediately brings the statement of Abaye with relation to this discussion. Many have acted in accordance with the view of Rabbi Ishmael and were successful. They were able to make a living, and they were able to study Torah, and many have done this and succeeded. And many have tried Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, but were not successful. In other words, he doesn't say, by the way, that no one has ever not succeeded in such an enterprise, but very few. In other words, you cannot rely on such success if you try that path. Rabbah also says something similar. Malu Rabbah Rabbanan b'metutha minaychu. I beg of you, b'yomei Nisan u'b'yomei Tishrei la tithazo kamai. In the month of Nisan and Tishrei, do not come to the Beit Midrash to learn Torah. Ki hechi dela titoradhu b'mizanaychu kula shata. As Rashi explains, Yomei Nisan is Yomei HaKatzir, Yomei Tishrei is Derichat HaGatot Abadim, the time for pressing wine and oil and what have you. In other words, these are times where you must expend much time and energy in these agricultural activities, and therefore you must study. You will have to study less Torah during that time. And do not come to the Bet Midrash. Don't come to me and try to study Torah at that time. It's not the right time, because then the rest of the year you will have a serious problem. And then we have one more statement which is relevant to this discussion. Amar Rabbi David Bar-Hayim, Amar Rabbi Yohanan, Mishum Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Ilai, famous Rabbi Yehuda. Bo urei, shelo kadorot harishonim, dorot ha'aharonim. Dorot harishonim asu toratan keva umelachtam arai. Wazo nitkayama biyadam. Rabbi Yohanan, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, who is the colleague of both Rabbi Ishmael or mainly of Rabi Shimon, he says, Dorot Rishonim were more successful and were on a higher level than Dorot Aharonim. Why? Dorot Rishonim asu toratham keva umelachtam arai. Because they knew how to maintain that correct balance. They studied Torah, and that was the main focus of their lives. But they also did malacha, and it was arai. In other words, it was fitted in and it was done as necessary, but it wasn't the main purpose. It was not the main impetus. It was not the central theme of their existence. However, Dorot HaAharonim, you would think it would be the opposite. You would think that they at least would be more successful, but he says no. There are two very important and profound points to understand with regards to this statement of Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai. First of all, it's clear that he's agreeing with Rabbi, with whom? With Rabbi Ishmael, not with Rabbi Shimon, because he says Dorot Rishonim Asu Toratham Keva Umelachtam Arai. So they were busy studying Torah and doing Malacha. They weren't just studying Torah. That's not Rabbi Shimon's position. Rabbi Shimon says just Torah. And if you do so, or if Am Yisrael does so wholeheartedly, then they won't have to worry about everything else. That's not what Rabbi Yehuda says. So Rabbi Yehuda is on the side of Rabbi Ishmael, but he adds an extra angle to this discussion. He says, even when you are following the pshat of the pshuto shel mikra, the pshat of the pasuk, wasavta d'chanecha, as Rabbi Ishmael teaches, you can go about this in two ways. You can make your Torah keva and your malacha arai, which is how it should be, or you can do the opposite. And he says the secret to success, real success, is to la'asot et Torah keva wa malacha arai. So, according to what we're seeing here, Rabbi Yehuda is clearly coming down the side of Rabbi Ishmael, but he adds this proviso: do not think that wasafta d'chanecha means that you can be completely consumed by financial and material concerns and endeavors. That is incorrect. That is a mistake, and not only is it a mistake in terms of understanding how a person should aim to run their life, you will also not succeed. You will succeed less. It's paradoxically, you would think the more time I spend on my parnasa, the more money I'll make, but it doesn't necessarily work that way, says Rabbi Yehuda. Because why? Because there's something else, which is pass me the Chelik Bet of the Rambam Meduyak behind you. Chelik Bet. If you recall, some weeks ago or more, no, I'm sorry, my mistake. I need the Chelik Aleph. If you recall, we discussed what Rambam writes at the end of Ilchot Shemitah v'Yovel. Perek 13, Ilchot Shemitah v'Yovel. Rambam speaks here, and we mentioned this before, it's worth mentioning in this context once again. Rambam speaks here about Shevet Levi. Why does Shevet Levi not receive their own Nahara in Eretz Yisrael? And he says, وَلَمَا لَوْ زَخَى لَوِي بِنَحَلَةِ اَرَتْ يِسْرَائِلُ وَوِزَثَى إِمْ أَحَا. Why does Shevet Levi not have a part, chelik in Eretz Yisrael, and they don't receive part of the bizah, the shalal from the enemy in war, after war? מِپְנَי شَهُفْدَى لَعْبُدَةَ هَشَمْ وَلَشَرَثُ. Shevet Levi have a divinely ordained destiny and purpose, and that is to live differently from most people, from the majority of the nation. ולהורות דרכיו הישרים ומשפטו הצדיקים לרבים, שנאמר יראו משפטיך ליעקב ותורתך לישראל. Because of this purpose that they have, this is the reason for having a Shevet Levi, of people who will be more focused on the spiritual concerns, and they will be the experts in Torah normally. לפיכך הובדלו מדרכי העולם. They were set aside from the normal ways of the world, of life. לא עורכים מלחמה כישראל, they do not take part in war. ולא נוחלים, and they do not receive their own inheritance as a tribal inheritance. ולא זוכים לעצמם בכוח גופם, אלא הם חיל השם. Hashem takes care of them. שנאמר, ברך אדוני חילו, והוא ברוך הוא זיכה להם. שנאמר, אני חלקך ונחלתך. Now Hashem provided for them by way of Turumoth and Ma'asroth and Matnoth Kahuna, etc. And then Rambam continues, and he says, "V'lo shevet Levi bilevad, ela kol ish ve'ish mikol ba'ei olam." He says, "He kol ba'ei olam, Jew and non-Jew. Asher nadava ruho." Any person who makes a conscious decision to dedicate himself to Hashem, v'hevin mida'atho lehibadel la'amod lifnei Hashem l'sharatho u'la'ovdo. Any person who makes that choice is fully commits himself and his life to Hashem, l'da'ayat Hashem, to know Hashem, v'halach yashar kamo she'asahu ha'elohim, she'asahu ha'elohim, and walks in the straight and narrow correct path, u'farak mi'al savaro ol ha'heshbonoth harabim asher bikshu b'nei ha'adam, and sets aside all the normal considerations and aspirations of most people. Hareza nitkadesh kodesh kodashim. Such a person becomes mamash kadosh, special, different. Muvdal. The word kadosh means muvdal, set aside. V'yeh Adonai helko v'nahalatho le'olam u'le'olamei olamim. And Hashem will be his nahala. V'yizakelo ba'olam hazeh davar ha'maspik lo. And Hashem will take care, will provide for such a person in some miraculous, surprising manner, but this person will manage. As Hashem took care of the Kohanim and the Leviim. So Rambam writes at the end of Hilchot Shemitah v'Yovel. This is discussing an individual who wishes to dedicate themselves to Hashem, and then the question becomes into studying Torah or teaching Torah, or whatever other kind of avodat Hashem it may be. The obvious question is, how will he make a living? How will he survive? So this is the answer. What is this? This reminds us of whom? Of what Rabi Shimon says. In other words, there is such a way. There is yesh derech shekazo, yesh hashkafa shekazo. There is such a reality, but it's for the very, 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 very few. It's for yihides hula mamash. It cannot be. It cannot be nahalat harabim. It cannot be the way for the many. It cannot be the the way of life, the hashkafa, the attitude for the tzibur. Kal v'chomer, even more so, not for an entire nation. In other words, you can talk about a tzibur in the more limited sense of a neighborhood of Jews, a ghetto of Jews, a town of Jews. But if you're talking about a nation, a sovereign nation living in its land that has to deal with everything that entails and implies, such a nation will not survive in the real world if everyone is just studying Torah. An individual can make that choice, and even then, what did Abaye tell us? Abaye told us, Harbe asuk Rabi Ishmael wa'alatha biyadam. Very few have, he didn't say no one has done it, but he says, Rabi Shimon wa'lo alatha biyadam. There are some who tried, most don't succeed. So it is for some, very few, but not for the many. And that's what Rabbah said to his Talmidim. Nisan and Tishrei are not good times for spending most of your time studying Torah, because then that's when you have to put your effort into your agricultural affairs, because that's your economic reality and success depends on what you do in those months. And that's what Rabbi David Bar-Hayim also said. Dorot Rishonim asu Toratham keva'u malachtam aray, and they succeeded. It's very, very rare, and therefore it cannot be a derech kevusha l'rabim. It cannot be the path on which most people tread to be like Rabi Shimon. That's the first thing we must understand from the sources that we've seen thus far. Yes, question, comment, complaint.
Is there really a practical difference between Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Shimon? Because to me it seems that Rabbi Shimon is agreeing that under normal circumstances, not ideal circumstances, we should be working on. He's saying in this fancy time that, in the future, Yemot HaMashiach, like it's talking about in Yeshayahu, at some point in the future, we're all going to put down our harvesting tools and we'll be able to learn all day. But would he really disagree that under normal circumstances we should also be working the land?
That's what we see before us. Are you suggesting that Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Ishmael were discussing what will be in some distant future time? B'mot HaMashiach? That's not the pshat. They're talking about the present time, right now. It is true that.
Because the pasuk in Yeshayahu is clearly talking about a future time.
These are all derashot not directly related to the discussion, obviously, but if we're talking about how to instruct people, how to educate people, how to train people, and direct them in this world, in all generations, then yes, we see that Abaye and Rabbah think that they're talking about the here and now. Abaye says, Arbe asuk Rabbi Ishmael. What's he talking about? The future? He's talking about Yemot HaMashiach. He's talking about now. When Rabbi David Bar-Hayim says, Dorot Rishonim asu Toratham keva'u malachtam aray v'zo alathab nitkayma b'yadam. He's talking about what happened even before his day. He's saying that is take note, that is what we should be aiming for. So there is a real discussion here. So it seems, at this point in the discussion, clearly this is how it seems. However, we haven't finished our discussion. Now, of course, it goes without saying that if we were to take the Dati Leumi world on the one hand and the Haredi world on the other hand, we would obviously see or explain the reality in such a way that the Dati Leumi world is following the Shita of Rabbi Ishmael, and the Haredi world is following, at least in theory, or as at least holding up as an ideal the shita, the instruction, the teaching of Rabi Shimon. Correct? That's what we would say, and that would be correct. By the way, this Shita, and this is now number 3 on page 2, this Shita of Rabi Shimon we find elsewhere, or something similar, because we find in the Yerushalmi, Masechet Barachot, Perek Aleph, it says, Rabbi Yohanan, B'Shem Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Kiron Anu, people such as myself, She'anu Asukim B'Tamud Torah, that we are constantly studying Torah, Afilu Kriyat Shema Einanu Mafsikim. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai didn't say Kriyat Shema. He was always studying Torah. He was constantly immersed in the Torah, in reciting and memorizing Torah and understanding and dwelling upon it and trying to fathom it more and more and perceive things on a more and more profound level. And such a person, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, such as someone like myself, is patur not only from tefillah, which is obvious, he says, but also even from Kriyat Shema. Now that's wonderful if you're Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, but Rabbi Yohanan says, Amara al-Garmei said about himself, Kechon anu she'anu asukim b'tamud Torah, she'anu, even though we do study Torah, but not on that level, afilu l'tfilah anu mafsikim. Of course we stop to say Kriyat Shema, we stop learning to say Kriyat Shema, but also tfilah. The Yerushalmi continues, then kedate, both are following their well-known opinion. Rabbi Yohanan kedate, dama Rabbi Yohanan, halawai mitparalim kol hayom. In other words, tefillah is always a good thing. So if a person is studying Torah and wants to stop to say do tefillah, shmona esrei, I'm for it, says Rabbi Yohanan. There's no question it's a good thing. In other words, he does not see any problem with stopping to study Torah for the purpose of tefillah, at least for most people. Lama she'en tefillah mafsedet. It's never a bad thing. It's always a good thing. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai keda'ateh, he says otherwise. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omar, ilu haweno ka'em al Torah de Sinai, had I been present at Har Sinai, b'sha'ata de'ith yehivath oraitha Yisrael, when the Torah was given to Am Yisrael, hawena mithba' kumeh rahamana, I would have asked from Hashem, that Hashem would create human beings with 2 mouths. Why? One with which to study Torah constantly, and the other to take care of everything else that he has to do with his mouth, whether it's eating or speaking or dealing with his melacha, whatever it is. However, he changed his mind. Hazar wa amar, now we see he only has 1 mouth. The world cannot stand all the lashon hara and all the negative speech that people tend to utter. If he had 2 mouths, how much more worse it would be. So Rabbi Shimon said, ideally I would have thought it would be good to have 2, we have 2 mouths, but I see that Hashem was correct, and it's better that we have only 1 mouth. What do you see from this statement of these ideas of Rabbi Shimon? Rabbi Shimon is describing his own very unique, subjective reality. He's not describing a reality for most people. That's clear. And it becomes much clearer from the following. We have 2 versions of the following information. The first is, the first one we'll read first on page 3, number 5. Yerushalmi Shvi'ith Perek Tishi'i. There we have this is the famous story of Rabbi Shimon in the cave, but it's a different, more authentic, original version, shall we say. It says as follows, briefly. It says, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Avad Tamir b'ma'aratha talat asar shanin. He hid in a cave for 13 years, b'ma'arat haruvin di thruma. That's what it says. The word thruma here is certainly, is clearly a mistake. It doesn't make any sense. Rabbi Shimon was not a kohen. Why would it be dafka haruvim of thruma? There's another word which is be replaced. It doesn't matter. This has been discussed by some of the mefarshim, but that word can be ignored for now. So he was hiding in this cave for 13 years. It doesn't say why he was hiding, In other places it does. It says Mufurash in Bereshit Rabbah, which brings much the same version of these events, this Agadah, in Bereshit Rabbah, Perek Ayin Hei, Parasha Ayin Hei, I believe. He says there, it says there was B'yomai Dishmad, or Dishmada. In other words, there was a time of Shmad when there were Gezerot against the Jews studying Torah and other things, and also because of his political activity, he was probably being pursued by the Romans. They wanted, as the Bavli tells us. So here it doesn't go into the details. It just says he was in a cave for many years. It doesn't mention his son at this point either. Ad shehe'ela gufo haluda. Eventually, his body, his physical, material existence, his body was negatively impacted by this, hiding in the cave, not being able to bathe, all sorts of things of this nature. His body was suffering. L'sof talat asar shanim, and after these 13 years, he said, "Lena nafek hameh makhala v'alama." Is it not time to go out and see what's going on in the world, or what I can hear in the world? Nafak v'yathavle al pema dima'aratha. He went and sat at the opening to the cave. Hama had sayad siporin. He saw a hunter trying to catch birds. This was usually done with a net and with some kind of, spreading some seeds or some grains in front of the net and whatever. And he was trying to catch some birds, probably pigeons. Peras n'sodate, and so this person opened up his net and prepared it, waiting for the birds to show up. Shema berath kala amora dimos. And birds were around, but Rabi Shimon heard or somehow perceived the concept of dimos. Dimos actually has to do with the English word, comes from the Latin, to dismiss. In other words, a person is set free. In other words, a Roman judge would say dimos, which means you're dismissed, you're free to go. So the bird was there, but it wasn't caught, Vishta Sevath, and the bird was saved. Rabbi Shimon, apparently, based on what we understand from this Lashon here, he saw this event that he had witnessed as an indication that he himself was now free to go. In other words, the Romans are no longer chasing, no longer pursuing him. Amar sipar mi ba'ladeh shemaya lo yavada. Even a bird is not lost from this world without Hashem willing it. Kol sheken bar nasha, how much more so a person. So if I somehow I was directed, or I intuited that I should go and look what's going on. I saw this event was there to teach me something. As the Baal Shem Tov used to say, everything that you see in the world, you can and should learn something from. Whether it's a positive thing that you saw or a negative thing, but you should learn something from it. Kad hama d'shadechan milaya, which basically means when he saw that things had quieted down politically, he was able now to leave his cave. Nahuth nahame behaden demosin de Tiberia. He went to bathe in the baths, the public baths of Tiberia. Amar, and then it goes on to say, it doesn't explain why he said this. It says, "Tzarichim anu la'asot takana." I have to do something to improve things in this town. As our forefathers did. It says when Yaakov and his sons arrived to Shechem after Maaseh Dinah, and after Yaakov was of the opinion that they were in great danger, but the Goyim round about did not do anything at all. They seemed quite fearful, in fact, to touch them, because of what Shimon and Levi and the brothers had done, which teaches you a great deal, that if you act resolutely, forthrightly, then other people around you get the message, as we said earlier. Everyone, if you want peace, make sure that everyone's scared of you. As the Roman expression was, if you hope and wish for peace, prepare for war. If people see that you're ready for war, then you're more likely to have peace. وَإِيهَنَتْ بْنِ هَعِيرْ شَيُعْصِمْ إِتْلِسِينَ. Itlisin means shop. They opened up shops and they sold things. مُخْرِمْ بَشُوك. Now, this version of events in the Yerushalmi is like many things you see in the Yerushalmi quite frequently, very, very in a telegraphic form, and doesn't explain everything, why everything is happening. But first of all, you should ask yourself at this point a question. This is Rabi Shimon who says that I study Torah all the time. I don't even say Kriyat Shema because I'm studying Torah all the time. And now he wants to start doing things in Tiberia. He wants to start beautifying the city. He's worried about urban planning. What exactly is going on? This is Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, who studies Torah 24/7. And then he goes on to a rather interesting story. It says here, there are those who explain this is because this was in the wake of the Bar Kokhba revolt, and there were many people who had been buried, perhaps haphazardly, around Tiberia. Ama nedake Tiberia. I know that there are a lot of places where there is safek, tum'ah, in the city of Tiberia, and I'm going to make sure that we deal with this problem. In other words, he took turmusin and he spread the seeds around. Literally, where he placed the seeds, the dead would rise up, though they were buried. Professor Chacham Gadol, Professor Yehuda Felix, Zichrono Livracha, explains in his Perush on Shvi'ith that what Rabbi Shimon could see was that where he would scatter the seeds of the turmusin on the ground in this area where there was supposed to be some graves, but it wasn't clear where, and where the turmusin would sprout and grow more quickly and more successfully, he would know there's a grave there, because the earth was not as solidly packed as it was other places, because there was a grave below it. That's one way of understanding. However you wish to understand it, all of a sudden Rabbi Shimon is involved in activities other than studying Torah. We don't have to read the rest of the story here, but the long and the short of it is, as it appears in the Yerushalmi, that yes, Rabbi Shimon was living in a cave for a long time. Doesn't mention his son, at least not at this point. Doesn't say why he was there, but we can imagine, and we know from other sources, as I mentioned, the Bereshit Rabbah, B'Shat HaShemad, and that's what we see in the Bavli. And let us look at the better known version of this Agadah in the Talmud Bavli in Masechet Shabbat, page 2, number 4, Taf Lamed Gimel, Masechet Shabbat. Diyafeve Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Shimon Uyatev Yehuda ben Gerim Gabayhu. These people were sitting together, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosef, Riz Chachamim, Rabbi Shimon, and Yehuda ben Gerim Gabayhu. And this person called Yehuda ben Gerim, as Rashi explains, Rashi says on page 3, Ben Gerim, Ben Ger Ugioret Haya. He was probably a Roman or something like that, and it's not clear whether he was, as we'll see, maybe he was deliberately some kind of a spy or not, or it's not clear. Patach Rabbi Yehuda Amar, Kama na'im ma'asehem shel ha'umah zo. Look how wonderful these Romans are. They built shuwakim and roads, tiknu gesharim, bridges, tiknu merhasaot, public baths. Wonderful people. It's great that we have these Romans here. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda is obviously not a fan of the Romans, but he says at this point in time we have no choice but to chafe in quietly and accept the fact that they are they are here and they're in charge, and we're living under Roman occupation, and we have to make the best of it. So we might as well look at the look on the bright side of things. Rabbi Yehuda apparently did not believe that it was possible or necessary or correct at that point to rebel against the Romans, and there were many Chachamim apparently who thought so. Rabbi Yosef Shathak. Rabbi Yosef decided the best policy is not to say anything. Ne'ina Rabi Shimon ben Yochai v'amar kol ma shetiknu lo tiknu ala tzorech atzman. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai didn't think that one should be silent. He said, I'm going to tell it like it is, and nothing to, you can't do it, there's a battery. I'm going to tell it like it is. Kol ma shetiknu lo tiknu ala tzorech atzman. Everything they do, they didn't do it for us, for Eretz Yisrael, for Am Yisrael. They did it for themselves. Tiknu shuvakim lo shiv bahem zonoth. It's all for their own purposes, their own material gain. All right, those are the three views that we heard. Rabbi Yehuda was in favor of at least presenting the appearance of being resigned to their rule, and even certainly not speaking against the Romans. Rabbi Yosef did not say anything. Rabbi Shimon attacked the Romans. Halach Yehuda ben Gerim v'siper divrahem v'nishmeu lamalchut. So this person, Yehuda ben Gerim, informed. Amru, and they decided, the Romans, Yehuda she'ila yit'ale, Yehuda will be rewarded. As Rashi says, liot rosh hamedaberim. It's not clear exactly what that means. Perhaps they rewarded him in some way or gave him some official position. Yosef Sheshathak Yighle Sipori. Rabbi Yosef didn't say anything, but we know what's in his heart, and so therefore we expect he should be expelled to the city of Sipori. Shimon Shegina Yarek. Shimon, who spoke against us, he should be executed. Azalhu v're tosho b'midrasha kol yama. So Rabbi Shimon and his son, they hid themselves in the Bet Midrash. They were there all day. Hawath ma'itha devitho rifta v'chuza demaya v'charechi. In other words, they learned Torah. They were hiding in some Bet Midrash, which is not the best place for Rabbi Shimon to hide. Where would you expect to find Rabbi Shimon? So it wasn't a very safe option. And his wife would bring them water and bread. But when things became more untenable, the Romans were searching for them, and they didn't think they would be able to continue in this manner. He was afraid that the Romans would grab his wife, torture her, and she would tell them where they were hiding. We can't rely on that. So they went and hid in a cave. This is already quite different from what we see in the Yerushalmi. Itrahish Nisa, something miraculous occurred. A tree, a haruv tree, was created, appeared, and also a spring of water. You see already the Bavli is already immediately in the realm of the supernatural, of miraculous goings on. Nothing like that did we see in the Yerushalmi, and this is not unusual. This is what we find time and again. وَهَوَا مَشْلَحِي مِنَيْهُ مَنَيْهُ, it should say. وَهَوَا مَشْلَحِي مَنَيْهُ وَهَوَا يَثَبِي عَدْ ثَوَرَيْهُ بِحَلَى. Now, in order that their clothing should not completely be worn and cease to be wearable, They removed their clothing and buried themselves in the sand and covered themselves. Kulei Yoma Gorasi, they studied all day. Be'idan Saloye, when they had to daven, Lavashi Mikasu Musalu, they would dress and daven. You can't daven when you're not dressed, at least in a minimal fashion. Wahadar Mashlahim Manaihu Ki Hechi Dala Livlo, and then they would remove their clothing again so it should not wear out. By the way, it's interesting to note, Rabi Shimon said earlier, as we saw, that I don't daven because I'm studying Torah all the time. Here it says they daven. So I don't know how to reconcile that right now, but that's an interesting point. They were in this cave for 12 years. Again, something supernatural. Eliyahu wakama pitcha di ma'arta. And Yerushalmi, somehow Rabi Shimon concluded it was time to check what's going on in the world. Here it says Eliyahu came to. You can understand it in the same way. I'm not saying these are two different, completely contradictory narratives. Eliyahu can be a way of expressing the idea that the thought was introduced into Rabbi Shimon's head that he should check what's going on outside. So and Eliyahu Navi said, "Man lo da'el levayu demit Kesar." Who's going to tell him that the Kesar is dead? In other words, Hadrian, Adrianus is dead, which is true. Not a very long time after the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, he died. And now it's safe. He can come out. Nefaku. So they did. They came out. It doesn't say how they knew, but somehow they knew. Hazoi nashe dekar karabe was zar'e, and they saw people plowing and seeding the fields. What does Rabbi Shimon say? Amar manihim hayy ulam wasakim b'hayy sha'a. And what does Rashi say? Osakim b'hayy sha'a devshal yadei nochrim. V'akadosh baruch hu mahalek mazon v'revach le'oser rutzono. Again, this is the classic shita of Rabbi Shimon. Why? I don't understand. How can people spend their time plowing and sowing the field? They should be studying Torah, and Hashem will provide. This is the classic statement and position of Rabbi Shimon. What happened? Kol makom shenotanim einehem miyad nisraf. Wherever they turned, it literally went up in flames. In other words, what does that mean? I don't think it means that everything went up in flames. I think that what it means is that wherever they looked, they saw things that they couldn't accept, things they couldn't handle. In other words, this is not how it should be. The world should not be this way. Jews should be studying Torah and relying on Hashem, and if they were to do so and totally believe and commit themselves to this, they wouldn't have to live their lives in this manner. But that's not the way of the world, and if you view the world that way, then everything you look at, you will find yourself angry and critical and negative. So they had a very negative attitude towards everything they saw. Did you leave the cave in order to destroy my world? This is Hashem. Go back to your cave. In other words, you cannot work in this world. I created the world, and I decided it should be this way, and you think that it should be otherwise. You have to go back to your cave. Hadur Azul, they went back to the cave. They spent another 12 months in the cave. Mishpat Rashaim begenom 12 chodesh. So they felt that they were judged by Hashem to be mistaken in their attitude, their understanding. So they're like Rashaim who were judged. So we spent another 12 months in the cave. Now it's time to leave your cave. Nafaku, they left. Now what does it say? Kol heichad hawa maher Rabbi Elazar hawa maser Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Elazar, his son, and here we have the son is involved in the whole story. The Yerushalmi doesn't mention the son. Rabbi Elazar is a Kanai like Rabbi Shimon was all along also. everywhere he looked, he said, I don't understand people doing this, I don't like it, this is wrong, it should be different. Everything, he was critical, he was negative, he was angry about everything. Every time that Rabbi Elazar saw something not right, Kol Hecha de Hawa Maheh, where he would strike, as it were, Hawa Maseh Rabi Shimon, Rabi Shimon would merapeh. In other words, Rabbi Shimon would explain it differently, look at it differently. He would say to Rabbi Elazar, you should not look at it that way. And what does he say to his son? Amar le beni dai la'olam ani wa ata. It is enough in this world if there is you and I. What does that mean? Rashi says, Dai la'olam ba'uskei Torah ani wa ata. In other words, people who are so committed and so immersed in the Torah, like you and I, it's enough that there's a handful of us. You and I and a few others maybe. That is enough. And what does that mean, it's enough? That's the way of the world. The world is not designed for people like you and me. Most people cannot be like you and I. We have our way of living and existing in this world, but that's not the way of the world. And yes, there have to be some people like you and I, as Rambam said before about someone who wishes to dedicate himself to Hashem. Hashem will somehow take care of them in a miraculous manner, not in the normal order according to the normal order of things. But you can't expect everyone to behave like the way you see things. That's not reality. It's not Hashem's plan for the world. That's the ikar. Rabi Shimon, according to what we see here in the Talmud Bavli, Rabi Shimon underwent a major change in his attitude and his understanding of everything. He said, the way I view things, or I used to view things, is correct in some ideal realm, but that's only for the very, very few, and you cannot expect or even want this to be the case for the world, for everybody. And then it goes on to say, Ba'dei panya de ma'alei Shabbatha, on Erev Shabbat, Friday afternoon, Hazoahu Sabah, they saw an old man, Dawana Ketre Madane Asa, he was holding two bunches of packets of Hadassim, Warahed ben Hashem Ashot, he was running home with them before Shabbat. Amarule Haneh Ramalach, why do you need these Hadassim? Amalo Lichvot Shabbat, I'm doing this Lichvot Shabbat. With Yisgelach Behag, why not one packet of Hadassim? Why two? Had Keneged Zachor, Had Keneged Shamor. In other words, this is a Jew who loves the mitzvah of Shabbat. He's a Yehudi Shel Surah, a Yehudi Kasher Me'od Me'od. Amar le'livrei, he said, Hazik hama havivim mitzvot al Yisrael. Itva da'atayho. And then Rabbi Elazar also was able to view things differently. Another occasion, perhaps we can look at the Perush of Rabbeinu Agadol, Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook in Einaya on this Agadah. The point is, according to the Bavli, Rabbi Shimon himself was Chazel Bo. In other words, Rabbi Shimon was explaining and expressing a position which he really believed in, and he lived according to that position, to that understanding. But he came to understand eventually that his way is the way for Yehidim Mamash. Yehidim B'nei Aliyah, V'reiti B'nei Aliyah V'hem Mu'atim, it says in the Talmud. There are very few people like this. But you cannot possibly expect the world to work in this fashion. When I say the world, you cannot expect an entire town to work that way. You can expect a neighborhood or a ghetto of Jews somewhere in the world to live that way. Certainly you can't expect a nation to work that way. So, to sum up this discussion for today, the basic fallback position of the Haredi world, Haredi Rabbanim by and large, is the position of Rabbi Shimon. We see that. We hear it all the time. If I hear a certain well-known Rav say, don't think about the army, it's not important, all that matters is studying Torah, that's Rabbi Shimon. But clearly, if you can you can imagine that the Jewish world would want to support a certain number of real chachamim, people who are really osakim b'Torah on that level. And the truth is, this is how it always was in Am Yisrael. It always was that way. It was this way in the time of the Geonim. It was this way in the time of the Rishonim and the Aharonim, down to the present day. The Netziv talks about this in his Perush on the Mechilotha. With something similar comes up in the Mechilotha, which I didn't bring here. But what's being discussed there is the idea that in order to study Torah in great depth, on a very high level, one has to be free of worries regarding Parnassah. And the only way to achieve that is if the Jewish community is willing and able and interested in supporting such a thing. But you can't demand it. You can't demand such a thing. But the Jewish community should be interested in such a thing. This is why, in many places, a yeshiva was established, and there were certain people who somehow supported that yeshiva. I'll tell you about a story about Rav Kook. According to what I understand, when Rabbeinu Rav Kook was offered the position of becoming Rav of Yerushalayim originally, Tauresh, I think Pei Dalet. He accepted the position after he explained to them that you should know that I'm not very baki b'halacha, and I don't know lots of things, and you should just be aware of this fact, and maybe you want to think about it again. But this is in writing. This is not a story. That's in writing, in his own handwriting. That's what he said to them. Alright, so they figured that's probably only convinced them more that he's the right person, so they know they want the Rav to come, so he came. And he was promised some kind of income. I don't know, I can't remember the details, but for some reason it didn't quite work out. I don't know, the funds weren't there. Rav Kook, as long as he's the Rav of Yerushalayim, how did he survive? There were two wealthy people who decided that in order to have Rav Kook in our city, we'll do whatever it takes, and they supported him in some fashion. There were other Talmidei Chachamim who were not even zocher to that. Baal HaLeshem, the famous Mekubal, the grandfather of Harav Yashiv Zitzal, he and Rav Kook had a very positive relationship. They learned together Kabbalah, they learned together, etc. for some time. Once in the winter, the Baal HaLeshem came to Rav Kook to speak to him, learned a lot. There was the winter, and Rav Kook saw he came without a coat. He didn't have a coat. And Rav Kook understood he didn't have money for a coat. And Rav Kook did have a coat, and he gave him literally the coat off his back. He gave him his coat. He didn't want to accept it, but he forced him to take it. Money was not. It was not Yerushalayim Shel Zahav in those years. Mamash lo. I think times were very tough. So if the Jews are smart, if they know what's good for them, they will want to support certain types of people, certain kinds of yeshivot, certain chachamim, because it's the right thing for them. They themselves will gain in every possible way from such a thing. And we see this around the world today in different communities. They set up a kollel, they fund it, whatever, because they understand it's an important spiritual center and powerhouse for them, for the community. And that's true. But it's not something that you can impose on others, and it's not something, and this has nothing to do, none of this has anything to do with the Milchemet Miswah. I mean, Milchemet Miswah has nothing to do with Parnassah. It's not a question of who's going to pay for you or not pay for you, how you're going to make ends meet. Milchemet Miswah, as we saw explicitly in our earlier Shiurim, in the Bavli, in the Yerushalmi, in every possible place, it says explicitly that no one is patur in Milchemet Miswah. The problem. My point is this: the Haredim, Ahenu Haredim, have to do teshuvah. So does everybody else. But the Haredim also need to do teshuvah. We all need to do teshuvah, clearly. But the Haredim need to go through this process, this tahalich that Rabbi Shimon himself went through, and eventually his son Rabbi Elazar also. They want to view the world in that particular way, which is maybe possible for certain rare individuals in a galut type reality, when you haven't got the responsibility and the burden and of maintaining a Jewish state and everything that entails. The Haredi world, Haredi Rabbanim, are viewing the world through the lens of Rabbi Shimon, before Rabbi Shimon himself changed. The Talmud tells us that he changed. Rabbi Shimon, and even now you go back to the Yerushalmi version, there Rabbi Shimon also changed, because he was learning, and all of a sudden he goes to Tiberia and he wants to start improving matters and helping people out. The Kohanim can't go through this field because maybe they're metim there, so they have to go around. Alright, so they go around. So they'll take another 5 minutes walking around. What's the big deal? You have to spend He felt now that he had to do something. Why? Something changed. It's not the same Rabbi Shimon as before. In the Yerushalmi, in the Bavli version, it's clear that his son was still very critical and negative and unimpressed with what he saw in the world. And Rabbi Shimon said to him, "No, that's not how that we were wrong. I was wrong, and you have to realize that you too are now making a mistake. It's time to change your view. It's a more difficult." Spiritually, philosophically, it's a more difficult position to hold. It's very easy to be black and white and to say, you want geula and you're telling me that this is a process of geula and there's wars and there's armies and we need soldiers, but I'm not interested in this kind of thing. Zelo bishvili, it's not for me. Take my number. When the Mashiach comes, call me and I'll come. But in the meantime, I'm in the yeshiva. That's the Haredi attitude. That's Rabbi Shimon. Melachtam na'aseh b'dei achirim, b'dei zarim. But that's not Torah Eretz Yisrael. It's not Hilchot Melachim or Milchamoth. It's not the reality of the Torah. It's not Ki teseh milchama al oyevecha. It's none of those things. It is a very specific, very limited, and in the final analysis, incorrect understanding of Jewish existence and Torah life. Here and there will be individuals who succeed somehow in never working a day in their lives, not because they're lazy, but because they're on a different plane and they are predestined for a different type of existence, and they're willing to pay a price for that. Such people are very rarely wealthy and well-to-do and without problems of that nature. But it's also a fact, as the Netziv writes in his Perush on the Mechilotah, for example, that as it is obvious, as it says in the Gemara, Shma'atita ba'et silutha. In order to get to the bottom of a sugya in the Torah, you have to have clarity of mind. You have to be free of da'aga, free of worries of parnasa, and you cannot live in this Alice in Wonderland world. That's not what in the long run. When you look at all the sources, you look at Rabbi Shimon himself. He didn't maintain that position indefinitely. Eventually, they understood that they were wrong. And this is where the Haredim, in my view, today are misguided and have to do teshuvah. I'm not saying that only they have to do teshuvah. As I said before, we all have to do teshuvah. Every person, every group, every ideology has where it needs to change and fine-tune its approach and reevaluate various things. But with regards to the Haredim, with regards to the question of Giyus and Parnasa and all these things, that cannot be and never was intended to be Derech Kevusha l'Rabim. That cannot be the way for the world, for the public, or for the Jewish people. And that is why we have Hilchot Melachim or Milchamoth here in the Rambam, just as we have Yichot Shemitah v'Yovel, where Rambam tells us about the Yehidei Segula that can somehow live their lives in that way. But that's not the reality. That's not why we need a king, because the king is responsible for defense and making war and conquest and defense and what have you. That is the way of the world. That is how the Jewish people are to behave and to organize their affairs, trying to live according to some irrational and unattainable ideal is not the way of the Torah. Simply is not. And many things are connected to this question. In other words, not just military service, yes or no. The same position, the same kind of attitude and understanding of the world, or misunderstanding actually of the world, we find with regards to other questions like the Mikdash. If you ask your average Haredi, are you in favor of the Mikdash? Yes, very much in favor. How is it going to be built? It'll fall from heaven. If your entire position, your entire attitude to reality is completely this unreformed Rabi Shimon approach, then it makes perfect sense to assume that the Mikdash will fall from heaven, and it's reasonable to think so, and it's not something you have to worry about in the least. And the same is true for many things. This completely this ideology which is completely divorced from reality, it all comes down to this kind of unrealistic, unworldly, and in the end, non-Torah approach to things. But, however, that kind of approach became very much ingrained in many parts of the Jewish world throughout the Galut, and as we know, it's difficult to remove the Galut from the Jew more than it is even to remove the Jew from the Galut. Tov, Ad Kan Layom. Yes.
Took a ride one night from a cab driver. He's an Arab, and he's driving down the road. He's pointing at the Haredi people in the neighborhood. He said, I love all people. He said, I love the IDF. I love Israel. He said, these people, they're sick. There's something. He said, I know. I drive them all the time. He said, there's something wrong with them. There's something not right with them. Do you think that they have this attitude because they're mentally ill, or do you think it's arrogance or ignorance, or
nothing to do with mental health? It has everything to do with trying to navigate a very dangerous. We spoke before about the sea and sailors trying to navigate a very stormy sea, being very fearful for all kinds of outcomes, trying to opt for what seems like a safer, less hazardous path. But in order to maintain that, you also then have to convince yourself of various things, and you have to build an entire ideology around that to support it. And it's not true. I understand where it comes from, but it's not true. We see here, Rabi Shimon, there is that position. But the Talmud itself tells you, Rabi Shimon, and many try to do things like Rabi Shimon. We see that the Talmud itself tells you that this is not not even how individuals should run their lives, let alone a nation. Then we see later in the others, in Sachet Shabbat, and also in the Yerushalmi, although in the Yerushalmi it's more cryptic and much more brief, that Rabbi Shimon himself changed his mind. He adopted a different position. Rashi Tevot, this is a glass of water which is less than half full. Rashi Tevot Hacham is Hasi Kos Maleh. One has to understand that the glass of water is not always full, not exactly as you might want it, things are not as you might imagine they should be. But you should then also remind yourself that you know less than Hashem knows, you understand things less well, and you have to accept Hashem's wisdom and hashgacha, and you have to work within that reality and not separate yourself and divorce yourself from reality and try and exist in a completely unnatural and unsustainable fashion. That's what I would say. Yes.
Just one thing I wanted to note, that this type of unrealistic approach also causes deleterious effects regarding the image of Judaism in the eyes of the non-religious. Because
True.
people look towards Judaism, and for many Jews in Israel, being very religious is synonymous with being Haredim. So it turns a situation where being not so religious is okay, perhaps, but being very religious, which is Haredi, is no good, because that they associate that with all of this unrealistic.
Machon, you're quite right. There's an aspect of Hilul Hashem in this as well. Yeah.
So Rabi Shimon said Tov Shebagayim Harag after he came out of the cave.
I don't know when he said that, but why does it make a difference? It's true both when you're in the cave, before you're in the cave, and after you exit the cave. It's a correct statement. When you're in a state of war with regards to your enemies, that is the correct policy. We're not talking about that's nothing to do with how you deal with your enemy. The question here is how Am Yisrael
well, it's part of not
acts within the world.
Not working, and it's part of the.
Tov Shebagayim Harag b'shat milchama.
That means you have to be active. You can't have anybody. You can't just learn Torah. You have to go to war.
Well, I hear what you're saying. You're saying if Rabi Shimon says Tov Shebagayim Harag b'shat milchama, that means that you have to go to war, or you have to be active and rise up against your enemy. But of course, certain people of a certain persuasion might say to you, yeah, he meant to say you go out and kill the enemy. I'll be sitting in the Beit Midrash studying Torah. but that's not the point. Rabbi Shimon was not talking about war. It was not about matzav milchama. I think in war that was his position, that everyone should go to war. We've seen the Bavli. You saw in the Yerushalmi. It's clear in all the sources. We saw in the Aroch Laner. It's mefurash legamrei. B'milchemet Mithwa, everyone is chayav. We're talking, these discussions are more broad in general, not specifically about B'shat Hirum.
How do you suppose that this attitude be changed, that people make it stubborn? Like what will make them change their attitude and change course?
Perhaps they should begin with this listening to this shiur, the recording of the shiur. Maybe that will help.
Amen.
היו ברוכים, שלום וניצחון על כל אויבינו מבית ומחוץ.